Hi, I'm Bill Furlong, and along with my colleague Dr. Mary Crossan, we co-host our podcast, Question of Character, where we answer all of your questions about the Ivy Leader Character Framework. We're delighted you can join us today. And remember, if this is your first exposure to leadership character, you might want to listen to our first two episodes, kind of like a Leader Character 101 A and B. And that will give you the basic foundations of the Ivy Leader Character Framework, and it will allow you to get more out of this episode and other episodes as well. So now I'd like to introduce you to my co-host. She is a distinguished university professor at Western University, teaching at the Ivy Business School in London, Ontario. Her research has been published in the world's most prestigious journals, and she's author of the book Developing Leadership Character. She is Dr. Mary Crossan. Mary, welcome back. It's such a pleasure to have you join me again today.
Hi, Bill. Great to be here.
And now I'd like to welcome, I should say, today's very special guest. So this is a bit of a long intro here, but stick with me, it's well worth it. He was born in Toronto, Canada, and was selected by the Pittsburgh Penguins in the 1977 entry draft. In an NHL career that spanned 14 seasons, 604 games, and 6 teams, he racked up 215 wins, 17 shutouts, and a very respectable 3.787 GAA, goals against average, in that very high goal scoring era. And most people actually don't realize how hard it is to play a single game in the NHL, let alone 604. And in 1982, he represented Canada at the World Hockey Championships in Helsinki, Finland. And following his retirement in 1992, he got even busier. He's been an NHL broadcaster for the iconic Hockey Night in Canada and also NHL on Sportsnet for 27 years. During that time, he has covered 3 Olympic Games, 2 World Cups of hockey, 12 Stanley Cup finals, 12 NHL All-Star games, and countless regular season games. And while doing all of this, he received his master's degree in leadership from the School of Management and Economics at Guelph University. He's also working with professional sports teams, most recently the Carolina Hurricanes, and corporations, concentrating on the field of character leadership. He's also a professor teaching leadership at Fleming College in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. He is Greg Millen. Welcome, Greg, and thank you so much for joining us today.
All that means is that I'm really old, Bill.
Yeah, but you've used your time well, Greg. So that's
yeah, I guess.
And it's again, Greg, thanks again for joining us. And it's a real pleasure for Mary and I to welcome you today.
Thank you. It's great. And anytime you can talk about character, something that Mary has helped me along with so much, and Bill, joining you many times as well in different seminars. It's a topic that I think is very important and one that we all enjoy talking about.
Splendid. So today's podcast is around the question, how can leader character be applied to elite sports? And this would be elite sports at all levels and all ages, and from athletes to coaches to management. And you may be surprised to know that leader character has already been actively employed in a number of different areas. And so pro hockey has been one, professional hockey, and also in Formula racing. And Mary has had some experience there as well. But our focus today, of course, will be on professional hockey. Greg has had 4 decades either playing or being engaged in some aspect of professional sports. And we're going to ask him some of the questions we have around the leader character framework and how that's applied in terms of his experience. And both Mary and Greg have had direct experience applying leadership character in this context as well. And also both Mary and Greg have competed at very elite levels. Greg, of course, in the NHL, and Mary at the university level in volleyball. And they've observed, and I think and learned, that leader character is both accessible and applicable to athletes, coaches, and managers at all levels in sports. So, Greg, my first question really is to you, and your journey around leadership character. When did you first learn about leadership character, and what was it that appealed to you?
Well, I mean, first off, I guess leadership in general appealed to me because around sports my whole life, I've realized the impact and the importance of leadership in a general sense. So I went back to school for that reason. It was a sort of a bucket list thing. My wife went back to school. She motivated me to go back, and I found a program that I could do online, which was good for me at the time because I was still am broadcasting. So that was the first step, and then kind of a fluke after that because I was at a birthday party. I think it was Mary for a colleague or for a friend of my wife's and Mary's and myself as well, up through the university, way back in the university days for them. And Mary asked, I got together with Mary and she asked what I was doing. And I mentioned to her that I just ended up graduating several months before that. And Mary immediately, her eyes perked up and she sort of looked at me and said, well, what about leadership character? We're doing all this work on it. And of course, for me, that really resonated in a hurry based on my value on character in sports and over the years watching how important it is. So ever since then, frankly, Mary's been my mentor in this area, and she's taught me so much. She's dragged me along, thankfully, and I'm so appreciative to certain seminars that she's conducted or worked with corporate people, which again I'm very thankful for. And then we collaborated together, doing a little work with Carolina. So it's been a great journey. I'm still learning. I think we all are in this area, but certainly it's been nice to pass the knowledge that Mary has taught me on to young people and generally international students from India. So and you find very quickly that character is worldwide, which was a huge lesson for me along the journey.
And that's a really good point, Greg, too, you're raising is that the idea that the character framework is really something that crosses cultures. And we've seen that, and Mary's seen that, I think, in lots of different applications.
Bill, one of the things I'd say about Greg, and it's a theme that's recurring through some of these podcasts, is that people underestimate often what they bring with their expertise. Like for you, Greg, this incredible background that you bring in sports, and the engaged scholarship approach where somebody like me as an academic who understands the sporting context but hasn't lived in it, that when we combine our efforts, we bring this incredible combination of the deep theory and research to deep practice that takes some great insights and background and the science around character to knit it together into practice. And Bill, we've seen this story play out. So I really hope for people who listen to these podcasts is not to underestimate from where they sit what they can do. So it wasn't so much, me necessarily dragging Greg around. It's back to this great appetite Greg had to learn more, to think about what was going on, to ask questions, to think about where this could go. And Greg, your eyes would just light up about all of this. And together, we have done such great things. And that, I think, is a message that continues to resonate with people.
Yeah, but in fairness too, Mary, the one thing that I'm always amazed at, and quite recently we just had another session with an NHL team, that you have a great understanding for sport. One, because you played it at a high level and you can talk our language in professional sports. Not many can because you have a great ability to do that. And the other thing with your kids, I mean, you have a varsity, or pardon me, a daughter that went very far in golf to a U.S. scholarship, and a son that's same with Formula Racing, very involved right now at the extremely high level. So that background that you bring as well, I never have to worry about you with the hockey world because you fit right in, and that's a huge asset that you have that you often sell yourself short about, or maybe you don't, but I realize that I'm never thinking. I never have the cringe thing going like, oh, Mary, why'd you ask that? Never.
That's fantastic. And I couldn't agree with more of your sentiments you had, Mary, regarding Greg, and Greg with Mary back again. So let's talk a little bit about character, Greg. I mean, in sports, and everyone knows that character is important. You always hear about, oh, he's a character guy, or here's a team with a ton of character. So then you can think about leadership character as maybe being applicable to sports in that sort of at that elite level. But kind of haven't they figured this out already? Doesn't everyone, through psychometric testing, through interviews, sports psychologists, what's new or different here around the leader character framework that Ivy has been sharing?
People don't understand character. I tell this story often that we used to be in a locker room and we had that one player that would wait for the coach to come in before the rah started from the player. Often not a good player, but kept in the league because everybody thought the particular player had all this character, meaning the management, because The player knew what to say and how to say it and when to say it to the coach. Meanwhile, the coach would come in and say, "Why don't you be like so and so? Look at all the character they have." And then we'd look at each other and go, that guy doesn't have character, because we lived with him every day. So I think, it can be a little bit confused character sometimes. The other thing that everybody thinks you can fix a player. It's going on right now. We're in the middle of a day where it's a very active trade day when we're taping the show. And everybody thinks they might be able to fix that player because the player has competence, all the skill. And then they quickly find out that 9 times out of 10, they can't. And I think for all minor hockey coaches, I'm sure a lot of you are minor coaches in any sport, forget hockey, have watched a player come up with all this tremendous skill. And you look at this player and think, this player for sure is going to play at an elite level. And then the player doesn't. And you look back, we've all played with those players in sports. I know the two of you have, where you thought, I can't believe that player didn't make it to whatever elite level it might have been. And normally, 9 times out of 10, there wasn't everything in the player's toolbox. And one of the things that wasn't in the toolbox was character. And to make an elite level at anything you do, you need your toolbox relatively full. And I would suggest, if you're going to have a toolbox to play or do anything at an elite level, the number one tool in the box has to be character. And as a professional athlete, either in the business playing or watching as a broadcaster, character is number one in terms of success, not skill.
So, and then sort of going back on that, we've seen, I mean, pro sports teams and at the elite levels, they must be looking at character and they must be trying to get at character. But I think leadership character brings something different to that discussion than others. Is that a fair thing to say in your experience, Greg?
I suppose it's how you coin, leadership character. I guess for me, the way you do is what Ivy has done in terms of identifying character through leadership. So now there's what it's been called the character wheel, where you can actually look at the different aspects of character with some research behind it that Mary and their group has done, and then take that to a different level for a player, or not just a player, a team, an organization. I look so many times in business right now, and I can tell you, they're all about profit. They're not very much about character often. And unfortunately, what happens is profit goes down because people aren't happy. People don't understand what's going on. People aren't communicated to. There's no collaboration. There's no humanity. There's no humility to a certain degree at times. And so it starts at the very, very top. And it's no different in a professional sports team, whether it's there, whether it's in a corporate company. It doesn't matter. And the beauty now is that Mary and her team have a character wheel with a reference to it. And that reference can be used, and you can call it leader character or just plain, evaluating character. And that's a huge asset.
I would add maybe a couple of things there is that for people listening and they may not understand why we have the word leader in there, it is because it's the disposition to lead, not the position to lead. So for athletes, we underestimate what it takes to actually be in crucible moments and have that disposition to lead. Just watching the Masters tournament yesterday and watching a player come into the back nine and try to defend their lead, you can understand that that's not just a competence issue, but it's one of character that allows you to stand up against that. Now, and I'd also say what we've been using maybe an inappropriate toolkit to try to deal with character because we haven't understood what it is. So we deal with things like personality and we deal with it in things like style. But character, the science of character shows us that there are, as Greg has talked about in that wheel, these 11 dimensions of character that we can actually exercise, like the anatomy and physiology of the body, and that weaknesses in one area undermine the entire system. And it's that science that we bring to it that I think has the potential to really transform sports. And I want to go back to one thing, Greg, about when we first talked about this. I remember you saying, if we were able to work in professional sports and help people understand how character makes a difference in professional sports, it would cascade back into amateur sports, because I think what you were observing, and I had also observed, is that we weren't seeing the elevation of character alongside competence in sports. It was just such a missed area. And in fact, we'd seen a lot of toxic aspects, dysfunctional aspects, where people were overweighting some aspects of character and underweighting others, undermining in kids the very possibility of using sports to develop character. First and foremost, that the competence would come along with it, but that if coaches and organizations understood what character was, we could actually begin to manage it more effectively at the amateur level, leading into the feeder system for professional sports.
It's a great point, Mary, and let's think about that for a moment. I've watched a lot of, they like to put it now in letters, triple A, double A, single A, and categorize kids, which I have an issue with at a young age to begin with. So if you're triple A, you get to wear the fancy coat, and as a parent, you get to tell everybody in town that my son or daughter plays triple A hockey. And there's a bit of an ego thing that comes along with that, and I've seen it often. But unfortunately, it comes along with the coach as well. And now they're even paying coaches at this level. So now you got the coach that needs to win at this level. So because the coach wants to get paid. And so now we've got, kids running around that are 12 and 13 and 14 or even younger with coaches that are being paid, and wins and losses and competency becomes everything. Unfortunately, all of those kids aren't going to make the NHL, and nor is the coach, by the way. So now you've got an issue. There may be one that filters through in a small town once in a while, but it's a worldwide game now. It's all over the world. Just like any other sport, things have changed in that regard. So now, instead of when I grew up playing sports, basically because my parents put it in as a learning tool for life, the life skills go away because the character is not emphasized at all, other than the lessons learned by actually playing the game on the ice when nobody can get to the players. Because once they get in the boards and on the ice, they can't get to the players. So that's when they learn. But they certainly don't learn from a coach losing his mind, yelling or a referee, or yelling at a young 10-year-old, or whatever happens at a rink or any other sport in this day and age. And so there's a real poor situation in that regard. And, just like at the professional level, you never hear anybody teaching or having seminars about character with kids at a young level in sport. And yet it's the most important thing. I could tell you a story. My son, who got kicked everywhere, and thankfully came through it at the professional level all the way down. And I mean, kicked to a point where, you really question some of the areas of character along the way. And now he's in Ottawa and very settled in and actually reffing at this point. But the interesting point about all of that is that the lessons that he learned from that being kicked in the rear so many times, which I was afraid to death of would really affect him long term, has really turned him into somebody with abundance of character. Now, I'd prefer if he didn't have to go through that to get the character that he's had, but that's how that happened. So again, that was inside the boards, only from a reaction of lack of character that he learned that I'm not going to be like that when I treat people that way. So yeah, we need to have a real hard look in minor hockey, and it's not just hockey, by the way. I understand it's in every sport. Hockey gets labeled because it's the most popular game for the most part in Canada, but it's all over sports. It's all over young people. It's probably even in the educational system to a certain degree now. And it's unfortunate that somehow we can't inject character in the coaches and in the management and in the people that are making a lot of money administrating minor hockey, because they don't want to upset the apple cart either, because they're going to get fired if they do. So it starts at the very top.
a piece I'd just add that for, every player like your son who, you know, took the situation probably through your guidance and Annie's guidance, helped him interpret what was going on in those situations, right? To build character in the process. The worry I think we all have is that character can actually erode in the process. So, the the young athlete who is critiqued over and over again and never feels good enough in sport also learns that not to feel good enough in life. And that kind of thing is scar tissue that really starts to affect people well beyond sport. And I think this is where, if we can begin to help people understand that bringing character and the science of character into this, we can really make a difference in the lives of these athletes.
It's a great point, Mary. And let's not forget, too, or those same people end up being coaches. And they think that's the way you should be because that's the way it was when they grew up. Or they watch some coaches, there's not many left, in the National Hockey League that coach that way, the bully coach. And then they think, well, that's the way you coach because look at so and so. They coach that way and they're successful. Well, they're probably not successful. I can tell you and name a few bully coaches in the NHL that might have won the big prize, but they only won it because they had a huge amount of character in the room and a couple of assistant coaches that kicked the coach out of the room when they needed to make sure that the ship stayed together. So, it can be very misleading also.
So this is a great conversation. And I think, the point being is that character is such a critical part of, of sports. And if it starts to get used in pro sports in a way which is visible, it really would have this rippling effect, not just across different sports, but I think across society in general. So thank you for that. I think that's just tremendous. Um, Going back now just to the instance where I think Greg and Mary, you've both worked together, is you've had the opportunity to put in practice a number of these leader character ideas and the framework with the Carolina Hurricanes. I mean, would you guys maybe just take a few moments to tell us the story about how that came about? Maybe why did Carolina try it? Why did they think character was important and how this could work? And maybe just a bit of a description as to what you did and how you thought it worked out.
Yeah, I had to be very careful in the situation at the time, and still do to a certain degree. Although I'm at the stage of my career now, or oh well. But it's interesting because I have a great friend in Ron Francis who also as an 18-year-old lived with my wife and I, so we go that far back. And thankfully, I don't know that you can pick out a general manager, an athlete, or anybody that has as much character as Ron. Certainly, it's extremely high already. So we had a great starting point. And Ron understands the value of character, and obviously living it his whole life as well. And when I got together with Mary and got so excited about what they were doing at Ivy, I thought, Ronnie might like this. So I can remember we had a meeting outside of Toronto, and Mary brought her slides and kept it fairly brief. And Ronnie's eyes lit up. And fast forward, it was a job that was unfinished, but we certainly were able to get to talk to the young draft that came in and do a little seminar for them, introduce character to them. And then Mary was in the combine, which I wouldn't do, of course, because of my conflict of interest, but she helped out with the interviewing process and did a wonderful job with that, identifying character. And Mary might be able to enrich us a little bit in that and on that process. And as well, we actually even talked to the staff in Carolina at one point, which I thought was a very meaningful session. So hats off to Ron Francis for letting us open up in that area and understanding the value of character. And hats off to the players who did an incredible job accepting it, which isn't easy. Believe me, when you're walking into a professional sports locker room, they have a few of those. And I can remember a sports psychologist that came in at a very early age in a day of sports psychology, and he had us close our eyes in a room, and we were to visualize an elevator going up to tranquility. And believe me, our towels were in our mouths because we were laughing so hard at this guy. And could you imagine David Keon doing that, closing his eyes and visualizing an elevator going up to tranquility in the early 80s? It was a pretty funny story, believe me. So, you know, Dr. Silverstein, I think his name, we called him Silver Shrink. So he didn't last very long. But, again, that gives you get an illustration. You're walking into a room where, the guys are like, okay, well, now what? And so, again, Mary really bridged that barrier in an awful hurry, as she does so well. And Mary, you should maybe go from there. I've talked enough, but that's the Cole's notes.
What I maybe pick up on that storyline with Ron Francis is that I rarely have seen somebody pick up as swiftly as he did on it and move to action on it. Uh, it speaks an awful lot about him and the trust that he placed in me to go to the combines, because it wasn't very long between the time we met him to the time I was in the NHL combine, working with his team who had never met me or knew anything about character. And it was, right on, doing interviews and learning as we went. So, them learning about me, them learning about character, me working with them. And I would call it a real co creation process, right? That's what you're doing here. It's not me as expert imparting something on somebody, or you, Greg. You are kind of co-creating with the people in the room, an understanding about what character is and why it matters. So I think it speaks a lot to the individuals involved about, if I call it, willing to play, like willing to come and give something, right, a try about these issues. And why I do believe this works, something we've talked about in prior podcasts, is that this applies to people personally and professionally, right? So part of the hook of anybody who's working on character, for sure, these players are motivated to be higher performers. Like that, they're wonderful to work with because they want every edge, every angle, right, to be able to do that. So if you can talk about something that's going to do that, that's great. But they're also recognizing that they're living in a world with tremendous pressures and challenges associated with it. And if this allows them to navigate that in a way that enhances their performance and their well-being, now you've got something that isn't just for the rink. You know, this is something for life. And again, this goes back to our story about why it matters in amateur sports, where we're not expecting necessarily these individuals to go on and have a professional sporting career, but we want to develop the character that's going to matter in life, and have sports as a great place for them to be able to develop character. And I'll digress here for a moment because, um, Greg talked about my kids in this, and a lot of people would ask me when they were in high school, in particular, why I would allow them to play so many sports and do things outside, music and dance around things, and not have all their effort focused on school, knowing as an academic how important grades are. And I would consistently say they get out of sports, music, dance, and these other areas the development of character in a way that you do not get from simply focusing on academics in school. Yet, it is about doing this again in a way that is building character, not eroding character. And so we would find, even in sports, that you would gravitate, or they would move in the direction of sports and coaches that could develop their character, and away from sports and coaches that were undermining character. And the sad part for hockey, I have to say, is that it wasn't really giving a competitive advantage on the development of character relative to other sports. Well, even though it happens to be my passion, volleyball, there's a different kind of scenario in the volleyball field around who the coaches were and how they were developing character alongside competence. So it's really interesting watching all of this unfold.
And Mary, you nailed it on a very topic that I have a very strong feeling about. Uh, a lot of families today have decided that to make it, it has to be a one sport situation. And I think it's the biggest mistake you can make as a parent. I think that we're finding the best athletes and the best character athletes we find are playing more than one sport. Some of them are musically inclined. Some of them have other lives because hockey's a means to an end, no matter how you deal with it. And if you don't have a life other than hockey, it can be very problematic when you're done. That's the ones that do make it. But I'm also finding that the athlete themselves, and the latest is a kid that just was signed by the Montreal Canadiens, who could have been a professional baseball player as well, and a multi-sport kid who's a tremendous athlete and apparently a wonderful person, uh, coming out of U.S. college hockey. So obviously they have a degree as well. I do think that it's very, very important that kids play all different kinds of sports and do all kinds of different experiences, like Mary just mentioned. I know we did that in our family, and it's and yes, education's important too, but there's so many other learning things you can find from learning situations, rather, from learning all different sports, a cottage, or if you're fortunate enough, or even if you're not, anything, a soccer ball that doesn't cost a lot of money for families, anything at all to split up different sports, because you're going to learn different experiences, you're going to be a better athlete, and you're going to give your child all kinds of choices if you're fortunate enough to be able to do that, like many aren't. So it's I think it's a huge point by Mary, and something we don't talk about enough, again, and it really does relate to character in the big picture.
Couldn't agree more, Greg. So just going back a little bit to pro sports, and when I think about the leader character framework, it's taken something like character, which has historically been quite subjective, and using a scientific rigor, started to create an objectivity around it, so we can begin to assess it and develop it and use it. With all, Greg, one question I wanted to ask you was, is, you think about the use of advanced analytics in hockey today, right? Is there a way that, do you think that leadership character, by making character more objective, can be incorporated into that without losing the essence of what we're trying to do, which is actually, well-being and competence and performance?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that I've challenged Ivy with, Mary knows, a little bit in the past. To sell character, if you will, on some, uh, with this format, you need results, because we're in a results, particularly in professional sports, you're in a results oriented business. You either win or you get fired. That's the way it is for the managers and the people involved. So I've always, and yes, analytics. I'm an analytics fan to the point where it's another piece to the puzzle. It's not everything. It's, you find out about a player, you use your eyes, you use your homework, then you go down the hall and you ask the numbers guys. I call them the silly stats. What do you got down there, silly stats? And then they tell you, and then then you check it again. I mean, that's the way I would personally use analytics if I was in that form of life. I, I still don't I do underline the importance of it. So, the trick now is, can we find some way of measuring uh, character so that it'll help people use it more and understand it more, because then the results will improve. We know they will, and most people from common sense knows they will. The nice part is, thanks to the work that Mary's been doing, and Mary, you'll need to maybe explain this a little more, but there is some sort of different ways and means that they've been working on. I don't know how much is announced, so I'm not going to tell anything yet, but ways of judging and analyzing and getting some more information so that we can at least go to an organization, whether it be a corporate organization, whether it be a professional sports team, and say, hey, look at this. This is what's happened in the past. I mean, the story can be told now, but here are the numbers to go with it. And that's something that I've been trying to emphasize, only because, not that I don't believe in it, but I do know that how people can be so, like, because everybody thinks they have character already. Believe me. Like, if you start to talk about character, a lot of people shut down because they think, oh, I got character, I don't need to know about that. And particularly with egos in professional sports team at the management level. Oh, we're already doing that. They really aren't, but they tell you they are. They think they are because they think they are. And I've had that in a couple of questionnaires that I've done with a few of them. They really believe that they got the program all set up and characters. Yeah, oh yeah, we every player we do. But and a lot of them do now, but a lot of them don't. Mary, your thoughts on that?
Sure. It's just a matter of really setting up right analytics. Like analytics isn't more mysterious than the fact that you're trying to put, data around practice and look at your models and see where you're going. So one of the things that we wanted to do, of course, is that the big return on investment around performance comes from development. So, how do you actually develop character? And then think about that driving multiple different metrics of performance. For those in sports, probably the best way to think about it is, picture a training program that you put somebody in, physical, nutritional, exercise training, right? You could map the, strength and conditioning that somebody does and their improvement through to, competence sides, their skating improves, their speed, agility, et cetera, et cetera. That's how you want to think about character. Exercise science side of it is that you're going to work on developing that character, and then that character is driving individual, team, and organizational performance metrics. So one of the things that we built into the Virtuosity app, which we talked about in a prior podcast, to be able to build that into metrics that matter to organizations. So again, analytics is often about connecting data that you already have with data that you need or have in a way that you can begin to model it. Here's where I think one of the key things can be, just give you something practical. In a recent conversation that Greg and I had with scouts, one of the questions that they had was, when it comes to the development of character, are there some areas that are harder to develop than others, and some that are riskier for a team in terms of this issue about, if we, recommend that we're going to take that player on, can we actually work on developing the gap that they have? And if not, what are the implications for performance? And the piece that Greg and I found quite interesting in this conversation is, in spite of the fact that hockey and other professional sports have moved way down the analytics path, they're not as far down the path as you might like on the risk management and understanding of the development of character. Because here's the cool part, right? Is if you knew there was a gap in a player around character, and you also knew from your analytics that you could close that gap, you could take a risk on that player that you might not otherwise take. On the other hand, if you also know that that gap is really difficult to close, you've got data around the efforts that's required around, developing humility, for example, and players' vulnerability around things, and you go, you know what, that is a higher risk area to take. If you identify that as a shortcoming on the scouting side, you may not want to be taking that risk. So we see the analytics working all the way through a process in being able to identify players, in being able to develop those players, and then also, as Greg talked about, embedding it in the organization. It's not just the players. You've got your coaches, you've got the staff around this. I always thought it was interesting with Carolina that, had we continued to work in that organization, they were talking about working with the partners of the players, because a character is nested right within a larger context, and that's not just the player. It's, what support does the player have outside of the rink?
And I'll take it a step as well to another area. It's wonderful to develop and have the gap and identify it, but if you don't have the development mechanisms in place for the character, doesn't matter if you identify it, or doesn't matter if you want to get from A to or B to A, you can't, because throughout the organization there still hasn't been the development piece to continue on with that player as that player gets drafted, goes to junior, who's gonna emphasize the player, look after the player at that level. They go and look at skill in junior and work with them. Do they work on character at that level, or the college level, or wherever the player may be in the development stage, or even at the pro stage? Is there a piece where that player, or an area where that player can go to develop the character? So that's where Mary and I have found there's been a bit of a missing link as well. Uh, is okay. We know this player has this issue. We know that we can close that gap, but we don't have the proper mechanics in place to make it work. So that's an area that's quite intriguing to Mary and I that we've identified, and see if we can, maybe help out a team down the road in that regard. Because there's a huge disconnect between the scouts who know the player better than anybody. And once the player actually graduates and is with the big team, that's when the scouts right now, their job's over. Really, it shouldn't be, because the scouts probably know more about that player at a young age than anybody else in the organization. So that's an interesting piece to think about, as well as absolutely what Mary said about how you can tie it all in terms of metrics.
And one of the things, maybe to add, Bill, and connect to our prior podcast, is not to forget that Corey, so my daughter Corey Crossan, that we know on prior podcasts, her PhD dissertation is looking at the science of exercise in the development of character. And it's exactly using that Virtuosity app with college athletes and understanding the very kinds of things that we're talking about. So there will be a lot of data available in the not too distant future that really looks at these performance outcomes.
And let me ask a question. How many corporations have character development areas where they actually do that? They have HR departments that identify all the problems and then deal with the problems. They don't have HR departments that actually work on character where they should be working. So there's a huge issue in the corporate world right now on this, in my opinion, major issue. If somebody has a problem, well, let's just get rid of them. You know. Meanwhile, that person might be an absolute star in the competence side, but you know what? Too big a problem. We don't want to deal with. Don't have time for it. So instead of developing it, we'll just get rid of it. And that's where, unfortunately, the corporate world is. Not always. Mary's working with some great corporations that get it now, but there's very few. And so I feel, watching the way they're firing people, watching the way they're doing that, watching the way the lawyers are involved. You give a guy a box or a woman a box, and out they door the door, or whoever it is, a person, and out they go. They escort them, and all the things that are going on in the corporate world right now that way it's alarming. And I don't know where it's going to end up. I don't think it's going to end up well, based on the way we're going that way. So, it's not just sport, it's across the board. And again, I do want to emphasize the good companies that are doing an unbelievable job, because there are some. And Mary's been working with a few of them that are getting it and starting to change their process. One day they're going to figure out they'll make more money if people are happy and can't wait to do the job, instead of saying, don't say anything, hide. Whatever you do, don't rock the boat, don't get involved, don't offer anything, just hide. And if you're not noticed, then you'll probably last a long time. Boy, do I hear that a lot.
Greg, I think that's why all three of us are so excited about this work, is because its potential for positive change is enormous. And I think one of the reasons we're talking about it in the context of sports today is, oftentimes, for better or for worse, our society often takes its cues from pro sports. And I think if people start to see it being used in a way which improves outcomes and at the same time well-being, and all of those issues you'd mentioned earlier, I think the ripple effects on our society, on our schools, on our sports programs, on our children and our families would be just enormous and magnified and amplified. Couldn't agree with you more. Here's a question I have for you, Greg, and Mary. If you wanted to pitch in here, feel free. It's clearly that we've been talking about it, and again, in the context of professional sports. Clearly, we see that we believe, and we've seen, and you've observed where leader character can be applied, and character can be applied in these contexts. If you had one, for people that are listening today, and they're an athlete, or they're a coach, or if they're somehow involved in the management, either they run the local hockey league, the house league, or they're an executive in an NHL team. What's one thing you would recommend for an athlete or for a coach or for someone who's involved in the management or administration to do if they wanted to go forward and do something different or new today?
Well, as Mary mentioned, each of the elements, one works against the other, so it makes it a bit more of a difficult question. Uh, Mary knows what I'm going to say. I know that, and it would be humanity for me. Um I've always witnessed, either in a playing situation or even more so now in television, where I can walk into rooms and really, like, it's a beauty of TV. We have no pressure. So we can walk into a room and get a feel for the player and what's going on in the room, or players or management or coaches or so on. The coach that has humanity, that actually doesn't just stare you in the eye and come up with the answers that every other person would give, so he doesn't get in trouble. The person that actually can tell, wants to talk to you and ask about you as well, not just themselves. Or when you walk into a locker room and you feel the love for all the players, and that's basically what it is. Those are the teams that win every time. Every time, that's consistent for me. So, humanity and actually caring about each other and actually taking an interest in each other is a real big piece for me. Now, you can go down the temperance line. I know Mary's quite interested in that area at times, with situations, whether it be a coach, whether it be a team, whether how they react, like in the Masters yesterday. So, I mean, but it's interesting, if I took that character wheel and asked a coach, a lot of them would say drive. And I find that intriguing, because normally, at least at the professional level, it's there anyway. Now, it can be an excessive drive, so we can get into all of that, and that's Mary's department, where she really explains that very, very well. But the humility thing is there too. I mean, that's the other piece that's important, for sure. The great athletes have Ron Francis. He has an excess of humility sometimes. We talked to him about that. Where I don't think I'm saying out of school that sometimes he has to tell his story, because he's so to help share knowledge with others, and so that's an interesting piece sometimes as well, the excess of, or the lack thereof. But I know I've long-winded on this answer. The answer, quite frankly, for me is humanity.
Yeah, I love that answer, Greg. That's so specific. Mary, what do you think of that?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything that Greg just said. And
That's because you taught me. That's just a good professor. That's all that is.
exactly. Uh, what if we roll it up a level, is that there's a really practical piece, which is familiarize yourself with what character is and how it operates. Number one, inform yourself, live it yourself, work with it, observe within yourself where, as Greg talked about, excess of something, it's like you really want to have a high level of drive, but if you have that high level of drive, you also need high level of humility, humanity, etc. That's what Greg is observing here, and that often people have deficiencies that are not supporting that strength, and that strength is actually turning toxic. So those are things you just begin to observe in yourself. And what we do know from character development is that you really need partners. What I call a partner in crime on the development side, because we know from science that most of us believe we're self aware and very few of us are. And this gets back to Greg's point, is that people think they have strong character, when in fact, most of us have either weak character or unbalanced character. And we don't recognize, right, that we could strengthen and develop it to the extent that we could. I remember a moment where, a leader on the team in Carolina had just said, after one of our sessions, I I just thought you always were who you are. I didn't understand that you could develop character. And I thought this was a really interesting point, right? Is that we just go, okay, character is, you're either born with it or, and we haven't treated it the same way we would treat our exercise, that we could develop muscles around it, become somebody who has more courage, more transcendence, more humility, humanity. And then the piece I would add to what Greg said, which get to specifics around the dimensions of character. is put character in the foreground, not in the background. Have explicit discussions with players. If you're coaching, don't just coach on competence, coach on character. I remember a player that I was coaching in high school volleyball, and this player was going on for a scholarship in another sport. And I knew that she would struggle at a higher level if her humility weren't strengthened, because she had difficulty taking feedback. I was working on the competence side of things, but she would take it as undermining who she was, right? And so the issues were, my coaching had to be coaching on character in order to help her competence. And it wasn't simply about the sport that I was in, because I knew that wasn't where she was going to contribute, but that I knew I was setting her up for her coachability. So we use those terms, coachability, right? But we haven't really understood it takes a lot of strength of character to be a player who can be coached. And what if we could put character in the foreground, the competence being that's the crucible through which you're going to test character. Humility gets tested, humanity, temperance gets tested, courage gets tested, accountability gets tested. That's why I love sports, because it is a place where you can actually stress test character. And then if we could put it in that discussion in the foreground, boy, could we really transform how sports is embodied, how players live it.
I can give you a quick example that happens a lot, I think, is so when I was a young player, of course, I had an excess of drive. And if a player in that locker room didn't have an excess of drive, I had no time for them because my humanity level would have been low at that point in my life. So I just shut them down, and I was a jerk by the end of it all because I wasn't fair to my teammate. I get frustrated as a goaltender saying, nice going, and I start pointing. So, I mean, just a small example that happens a lot, an excess of drive. Humanity wasn't where it should be and it wasn't in place. I can give you a bunch of mine. I had a lot back then and still do. But, that's just one small example, very small of two working against each other.
Greg, so just following up on that last point you made, let's say then as a younger player and as a younger man, you actually had more in the way of this humanity. How do you think it would have been different for you in terms of your outcomes? Have you thought about that?
Oh yeah. And I think that humanity, one way to look at it sometimes is everybody has a story. And we don't often know what the story is. And when we don't know what the story is, we probably don't know why that player may not have the drive that we would like the player to have as a team. So once you find out what the story is, obviously your patience level is much better. And maybe you can help the person even when you find out what the story is, or find an area with a coach or whoever we didn't know. I mean, who knows? Maybe that person had all kinds of pressure issues. Maybe the person had something going on, in their family, or maybe there was a background issue. You never know. So, not that it would be my complete job as a teammate to dig, but certainly if I understood the player better, then, I certainly would have had more patience for the player. My performance would have gone up, not just the players, because, the negative effect that on my performance from feeling that way would affect my performance. So forget about the player for a minute, which obviously, if you understood the player more, their performance would go up too because they'd be comfortable. My performance would come up because I wouldn't be distracted. And I got distracted as a player, as a young player, far too much with that kind of stuff. I can tell you that right now. If I had a redo, it'd be completely different. But we don't get that rewind in life. We just learn from it. And that's, I can, and there's a lot of, and that's just not one. There's more than a few as a leader. I look back and say, I was a crappy leader sometimes in some of this stuff.
What I love about that story, Greg, and thank you for sharing it, is that when first you suggest to someone, oh, you need to be more empathetic and a bit more caring about your teammates. I mean, almost like the instinctive reaction is, well, that's not going to work. But yet, when you think it through, your performance would improve. The other player's performance would probably improve. There would be less friction on the team potentially. The team would be better. So just by simply adding a bit more empathy to the cultural mix, that you would inject, it produces an outcome that you might at first think was counterintuitive. And that's what I love that story for, because I think you're completely right. I think those great teams that you mentioned before have that sense of empathy and care for each other that allows them to win at the highest levels.
And I can give you a drive story too. And it was my first year in the league. I was just so thrilled to be playing in the league. I thought I was doing so well. I was playing, right out of a player that probably wasn't supposed to be in the NHL. And I had three of the veterans corner me at a team function. It happened to be my now wife was down visiting me as my girlfriend at the time with very limited time. Had to drag her to this team function, and she basically had to wait outside while three veterans cornered me and told me that your drive isn't good enough. You got way more level than this. Where's your next level? And they actually made me cry. That's how hard they were on me. And my poor now wife Annie had to sit out in the hallway for an hour and a half or an hour with the other wives where they were lecturing me. Now that was a school of hard knocks. You do that today, and young people don't, they don't do as well with it sometimes. They need 8 positives to 1 negative, but this was about 8 negatives to a half a positive. But I can tell you, they were saying to me, because they cared, there was some humanity there, believe it or not, even though it was a different approach. Uh, and I thank them to this day because they said to me, "You got another level. What are you doing? You're just happy to be here. That's not good enough for us." So it was a weird way of looking at humanity, and the way they approached it was interesting. It was a school of hard knocks, which we don't see as much anymore. But I thank them for it. So there's an idea of drive. Someone thinking they have an excess of drive, where a lot of people thought, well, your drive isn't where it should be.
Great story. We're getting close towards the end. I wanted to ask you one more question, Greg and Mary. Any thoughts you might have? And again, this is in the context of the episode today. Is where do you think this goes next in pro sports and maybe in pro hockey specifically? Is someone else going to pick it up? Mary, you've mentioned the Masters and golf. I mean, do you see applications and opportunities, and any thoughts on where it might go next? And Greg, I'll start with you.
I think it's coming. I think it's going to take time. Uh, I think awareness and the work that Mary and their group is doing is spectacular. Again, I think the more that we can prove that it works, not just on the outside, but with a little more meat to it, which is now happening, just because of the work that Mary's doing. There's more examples. It's going to help. Teams do understand character a little bit more. I can give you an example. Foligno was just picked up by Toronto. I mean, there is so much character with this player. He oozes with character. So teams are starting to recognize. I know they do in Toronto much more. So it's happening. Uh, it's starting to happen. When it filters down to the youth sports, I don't know. I don't know how that system's going to be fixed. I'm still not sure yet. Mary, maybe you may have a little more insight in terms of where we're heading with it, but I do think it's a slow snail's pace, especially with the U.S. situation the way it was the last number of years, which may actually accelerate it in the end. We're seeing how the new president has an abundance of character and humanity, so that will filter down through life a little bit more in a country that is looked upon as a world power. So it's interesting where it's heading. Um, but you get discouraged, then you get excited, then you get discouraged, then you get excited about this stuff. Mary?
Well, I'm more optimistic than discouraged for sure, because all the tools are in place for anybody. Somebody who listens to this podcast we just talked about in minor hockey or any other sport, they could begin to work on this. You don't have to wait to see somebody else doing anything. You start to apply it in your life, and we see all sorts of people doing just that. Um, so I think the issue around this is because understanding the anatomy and physiology of character, how it works, how you develop it. Yes, there's all sorts of tools around it, but somebody then starts to need to invest time in being able to do that. And we saw that with Ron Francis and Carolina. It can be done. So it's really a matter of people learning more and developing an awareness, and then taking it down the path of development and institutionalizing it. So I'm excited for the future. I'm excited for what this brings for athletes, fans of sports. Look at what is it that we really celebrate? Like, man, all of the great movies around sports are ones about character. There isn't a movie that you wouldn't look out there around those iconic issues or moments in sports history where it's character alongside competence, but it's usually revealing the character of the player or team in the midst of that. So I think it's there. It's just a matter of time.
You make a great point, Mary, because yesterday the network did a good job of telling the story of the winning Masters champion. And by doing that, everybody could relate a little bit. And everybody had a pretty warm feeling when that player walked down the 18th tee, to a point where some got emotional, like I always do, because it's a timing thing. It's where he comes from. There's so much more to that story than just being a winner, and that's normally what sport is all about for anybody who's played it, who's participating at any level. It doesn't matter if you're 6 years old or an old person or watching it. That's what character is all about. And we saw all kinds of aspects of character and thought about it, even though we don't know, probably we did, when that player walked up the 18th tee. The fans weren't clapping because the player won the tournament. And the fans some of them were clapping to appreciate the skill. I think a lot more were clapping because of the story. And that's always the way. We're storytellers in life. This podcast is a story. We're telling a story. And character usually is emphasized around a good story.
That is a great way to end our podcast. Greg, I want to thank you again for being such a wonderful guest and taking time out of your very busy schedule and to join Mary and I. So I want to thank Greg again for joining us today. We've talked about character, and everyone knows and talks all the time about how character is so important in sports at all levels. And it's why we undertake it, and it's why we think it makes the difference, that sort of elusive X factor between teams that win and lose, between first and second place. And the beauty of the leader character framework, as we discussed in today's episode, is that it takes something which historically has been subjective and puts it into an objective framework and gives us this sort of intelligent, intentional roadmap that we can follow. And like the stories we talked about, it's the essence of why we follow sports, and it's the essence of life itself. It's the idea of real hope, real inspiration, real aspiration, and a way for people to not only reach their fullest potential, but to reach their fullest potential in a way which is entirely consistent with and enhances their own sense of well-being. And it's applicable to all of life's activities, from pro hockey to minor hockey, to all kinds of, to the weekend golf warrior, to everything that we do as people. So again, a big thank you to Greg for sharing with us today his stories. To me, this has been an absolutely fascinating episode. And Greg, we've wanted to have you on this episode as well. From the first day that Mary and I started talking about it, we thought you would be a fantastic guest.
For me, it's a big thrill because I love talking about character, and I've got my mentor sitting there beside you. Well, not sitting, but in Zoom world or wherever we're at. And so it's always, I always learn something every time I end up speaking with you both. So again, I learned a little more today. So it's always fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And thanks for all you've done around the adoption of leadership character, all the work that you've done, a lot of pioneering work, and not just in pro sports, but also all the organizations that you work with and the students that you teach day in and day out, and the positive changes that you've made and continue to make in countless lives. We wish you all the best of luck in your future endeavors. We certainly hope you can come back sometime. And as these concepts begin to mature in the world that you inhabit, and we'll see how it goes. But in the meantime, I'll look forward to seeing and listening to you on Hockey Night in Canada and NHL on Sportsnet. So if you've liked what you've heard today, please feel free to share it with your friends and your colleagues. If you really liked what you heard today, please feel free to subscribe to our podcast. We also have a website called questionofcharacter.com, where we will be posting this and other episodes, as well as various resources and articles, and in particular, any links to today's that were mentioned in today's podcast. It's also a place where you can send us your comments, your thoughts, maybe some ideas on some ideas for future podcasts. We'll also post links to the Ian O. Inatowicz Institute for Leadership at the Ivey School of Business, where there's even more resources, articles, and information about the Ivey Leader Character Framework. So it's time to wrap up. Greg?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I guess my final thought is everybody that's been able to listen to this podcast, I would suggest you listen to as many as you possibly can, because in the end of the day, you can never stop learning about character and developing it. And I have a long way to go. So it helps me too.
You and me both, Greg. Thank you. Mary?
It's been great. So fun to have you on, Greg, and look forward to our continued work in this space.
Thank you both. Goodbye.